They taught you to look rich. They never taught you to be rich, and the law only obeys being. There is a quiet contradiction happening everywhere right now, and most people never stop long enough to notice it. Never before has wealth been displayed so loudly, so constantly, and yet felt so unstable beneath the surface. Screens are filled with symbols of prosperity, cars, watches, vacations, screenshots of numbers. Yet behind many of these displays, there is a subtle anxiety, a pressure to keep proving something that never quite settles. This is the modern illusion, the belief that wealth can be worn, staged, or performed without ever being inhabited. And Neville Goddard would have said this plainly: what you display means nothing if you have not entered the state that produces it. Neville taught that states, not actions, create outcomes, not effort, not motion, not visibility, but consciousness itself. A state is an inner position, an assumption so natural that it no longer feels like an attempt. When that state is occupied, the world rearranges itself to reflect it. When it is not, no amount of movement can hold the result together. He illustrated this with a simple but devastating analogy: an actor who wears the costume but never learns the role. From a distance, the appearance convinces, but the moment the actor must speak, respond, or move within the play, the illusion collapses. The costume does not save him, because the role was never assumed. This is where most people misunderstand the law of assumption. They confuse imitation with assumption, performance with being. True assumption is not pretending, it is identity. It is not something you do in public, but something you are in private, especially when no one is watching and nothing needs to be proven. Performing wealth is exhausting because it requires constant reinforcement. Being wealthy, as a state of consciousness, is effortless because it requires nothing at all. One is sustained by vigilance, the other is sustained by rest. Modern science quietly echoes this truth. Dr. Bruce Lipton's work on subconscious programming reveals that behavior follows identity, not the other way around. The subconscious does not respond to surface actions or verbal affirmations performed against belief. It responds to what it accepts as true about the self. Identity programs dictate perception, decisions, tolerance, and expectation automatically. When the identity has not changed, behavior may temporarily shift, income may briefly rise, but the system eventually corrects itself back to what feels familiar. The subconscious always returns you to the level of self you recognize as you. This is why money that arrives without a corresponding state shift cannot remain. It may appear suddenly, dramatically, even impressively, but it does not stabilize. It leaks away through impulse, fear, mismanagement, or invisible pressure. Not because money is fragile, but because the state meant to hold it was never entered. Wealth, in the Neville sense, is not something you chase or display. It is something you awaken to. And without that awakening, every external symbol of prosperity is only a temporary reflection, one that cannot last, because the inner image that sustains it was never formed. At some point, the appearance of wealth stops being harmless and starts becoming destructive. Not because there is anything wrong with beauty, comfort, or enjoyment, but because appearance without consciousness creates a pressure that eventually turns inward. When the state is absent, the display must work harder and harder to convince both others and the self. Neville was uncompromising on this point. Conditions follow states, never the reverse. When the inner position is hollow, the outer condition has no root, and anything without a root is living on borrowed time. To look wealthy without occupying the consciousness of wealth is to build a life on a temporary lease. It is like renting a mansion for a photo shoot while your name is not on the deed. For a moment, the rooms echo with grandeur. The images suggest ownership, and the illusion is complete. But the keys are returned at the end of the day, and the structure never belonged to you. This is how many experience money. They touch it, spend it, display it, and even speak confidently around it, yet it never recognizes them as its home. It passes through, but it does not stay. The collapse that follows is often misunderstood. People assume it is punishment, bad luck, market conditions, or poor timing. Neville would say it is none of these, it is correction. Consciousness always seeks consistency. When money enters a state that does not recognize itself as wealthy, the system adjusts until inner and outer are aligned again. That alignment often looks like loss, but in truth it is simply restoration to the familiar self. The state that says, "This is too much, this won't last," or "I don't belong here," quietly dissolves the condition that contradicts it. This is why effort alone cannot produce wealth, and why actions copied from others so often fail. The same behaviors that enrich one person bankrupt another, because actions do not carry power on their own. They are neutral. It is the state behind them that determines the result. Two people can make identical moves, speak identical words, and follow identical strategies, yet arrive at opposite outcomes. One is expressing a state, the other is compensating for the lack of one. And this brings us to the real disruption hidden beneath all appearances. If actions do not create wealth, if looking rich does not stabilize money, and if external movement cannot override an internal position, then the entire cultural narrative collapses. The question is no longer how to act, but what must be assumed. If conditions are effects and not causes, then wealth cannot be achieved by imitation. It can only be entered by consciousness itself. There is a moment in this teaching where the mind resists not because it is confused, but because it senses a reversal that threatens everything it has relied upon. The idea that wealth is a state of awareness rather than an income level dismantles the familiar ladder of progress. It removes the comfort of numbers, timelines, and measurable milestones. Yet this is precisely where Neville anchored his doctrine when he declared that consciousness is the only reality. Not consciousness as thought, but consciousness as identity, the silent assumption of what one is. Income, in this light, is revealed as a byproduct rather than a foundation. It is not the source of wealth, but the echo of a state already occupied. When consciousness is set, conditions rearrange to match it, just as sound follows the striking of a bell. Neville insisted that the inner position must come first, not as belief layered on top of circumstance, but as the fundamental sense of self. Without this, income rises and falls like weather, reactive and unstable, never anchored to a permanent inner climate. A simple analogy clarifies this reversal. A thermostat does not argue with the weather outside. It does not chase heat when it is cold or beg for cool air when it is hot. It sets a temperature, and the environment adjusts around it. Consciousness functions in the same way. When the inner setting is poverty, no external gain can override it for long. When the inner setting is wealth, conditions are compelled to conform regardless of temporary fluctuations. The mistake is believing that the weather sets the thermostat, when in truth it has always been the other way around. This is why chasing money feels so different from embodying wealth. Chasing implies absence. It reinforces the idea that something is missing and must be acquired through effort, strategy, or timing. Entering a state, by contrast, is not movement toward anything. It is a settling into what already feels natural. Neville described this as the difference between becoming and being. Becoming is endless. Being is complete. Once this reversal is understood, the entire pursuit changes direction. Wealth is no longer something ahead of you, conditional upon improvement or approval. It becomes a state that must be entered inwardly, assumed without negotiation. And if wealth is a state of awareness, then it cannot be reached through pursuit, comparison, or display. It can only be entered by consciousness itself, quietly and decisively, the moment one stops chasing and begins occupying. If this is shifting how you see wealth and identity, subscribe and stay aligned. Money has a peculiar intelligence that most people never consider. It is not emotional, it is not moral, and it is not impressed by effort. It simply responds to recognition. Neville would say that supply flows to the state that acknowledges it as natural. Where there is no recognition, there can be no permanence. This is why money can arrive suddenly and disappear just as quickly, leaving confusion in its wake. The disappearance is not random. It is the inevitable response to an inner position that never accepted the supply as its own. Assumption governs not only attraction, but circulation and retention. To assume something is to grant it a place in consciousness. When wealth is assumed, money circulates freely and stays without strain. When it is not, money feels foreign, excessive, or unstable, and the system quietly ejects what does not belong. Neville often emphasized that you cannot keep what you do not accept. Acceptance is not gratitude or appreciation, it is familiarity. It is the sense that this level of supply is normal, expected, and unremarkable. The analogy is simple but exact. Water poured into a cracked vessel will never remain, no matter how much is added. The solution is not more water, but a sound container. In the same way, money poured into a consciousness that is fractured by doubt, fear, or unworthiness cannot be held. The cracks may appear as impulsive spending, anxiety, sabotage, or constant vigilance, but they all originate from the same place, a state that does not recognize itself as wealthy. This is why financial instability often persists even after opportunities improve. The outer condition may change, but the inner structure remains the same. The mind still asks whether it will last, whether it is safe, whether it can be trusted. Those questions are not innocent. They are assumptions in disguise, and they instruct money to behave accordingly. Supply responds not to hope, but to certainty. Where certainty is absent, leakage is inevitable. So the question naturally arises, not from curiosity, but from necessity. If money cannot stay where it is not recognized, and if recognition is a matter of state rather than circumstance, then the entire problem shifts inward. The issue is no longer how to earn, save, or manage, but how to enter the state that holds supply effortlessly. And that question cannot be answered by strategy. It can only be answered by a change in consciousness itself. There is a threshold where identity stops being argued with and begins to be absorbed, and Neville placed that threshold in what he called the state akin to sleep. This is not sleep itself, but the softened border where the senses relax their grip and the mind becomes receptive rather than analytical. In this condition, the conscious guard loosens, and identity can be impressed without resistance. Neville was clear that ersatz is not a technique for getting things. It is the doorway through which one becomes the person for whom those things are natural. Wealth, when approached through ersatz, is not visualized as an object or a number, but assumed as a role. Identity is installed the same way an actor learns a part, not by thinking about it, but by rehearsing it until it feels familiar. The body begins to respond as if the role were already lived. Breathing changes, posture shifts, and emotional tone settles. This is why Neville insisted that feeling is the secret. Feeling is not emotion, it is the bodily recognition of identity. When the body accepts the role, the mind follows. The analogy is exact. An actor who rehearses a role deeply enough eventually forgets the effort of acting. Lines are no longer recited, they arise naturally. Movements stop being deliberate and become instinctive. In the same way, SATS is the rehearsal space where the wealthy identity is entered so completely that it no longer feels like imagination. The subconscious does not distinguish between a vividly assumed state and an externally verified one. It only knows what feels real, and it organizes behavior, perception, and opportunity around that feeling. Yet this is where resistance often intensifies. The mind pushes back not because SATS is ineffective, but because it is effective. Old identities sense displacement. Familiar limitations protest quietly, often disguising themselves as logic, caution, or practicality. The body may tense, the thoughts may wander, or the imagination may feel dull. None of this is failure. It is evidence that a deeper layer is being approached, one where identity is not discussed but rewritten. This resistance reveals something crucial. The struggle is not with wealth itself, but with loyalty to the former self. SATS threatens that loyalty because it does not negotiate with past experience. It does not ask permission from history. It simply installs a new inner role and allows the old one to fade from use. And it is precisely because this process is so intimate, so quiet, and so decisive that the mind resists it with such force. At this stage, something subtle but powerful emerges, often mistaken for wisdom. It speaks in a calm, reasonable tone and presents itself as realism, caution, or maturity. Yet Neville would have recognized it immediately as the old self-concept defending its territory. This adversary does not announce itself as fear. It presents itself as common sense. It reminds you of past outcomes, statistical probabilities, and lived experience, all while quietly insisting that change must remain within familiar limits. Divided consciousness is the condition Neville warned against most sharply. It occurs when a new state is intellectually admired but emotionally rejected. One part of the mind reaches forward, while another remains loyal to what has already been lived. This loyalty is rarely acknowledged, yet it governs behavior with precision. The former identity demands allegiance because it feels safe. It is known, and what is known, even when painful, often feels more trustworthy than what is imagined but unfamiliar. The analogy is stark and revealing. A former prisoner may be handed open doors, yet still flinch, hesitate, or glance over the shoulder before stepping through. The confinement has ended, but the identity has not. In the same way, a person who has lived within financial limitation may resist freedom even when opportunity appears. The resistance is not against money, but against the dissolution of the self that learned to survive without it. Survival strategies cling tightly to relevance, even when they are no longer needed. This is why inner conflict intensifies just before a genuine shift. The old self does not disappear quietly. It argues, delays, and reframes. It calls imagination irresponsible, rest lazy, and assumption naive. Yet Neville was unwavering here. What you consent to internally determines what you experience externally. Divided consent produces divided results. Wealth cannot stabilize in a consciousness that secretly remains loyal to lack. Once this is seen, the direction becomes unmistakable. If the resistance is internal, no external correction can resolve it. More income will not silence it. Better strategies will not dissolve it. The adversary must be outgrown, not defeated, by withdrawing identification from the self-concept that no longer serves. And that withdrawal does not happen through force, but through the quiet assumption of a new state that makes the old one irrelevant. When the state is truly occupied, something unexpected happens. The struggle to make things happen dissolves, and events begin to arrange themselves without announcement. Neville called this sequence the bridge of incidents, a chain of seemingly ordinary moments that carry one from assumption to fulfillment. What makes the bridge so easy to miss is its lack of drama. There are no signs declaring destiny, no sudden declarations of arrival. Life simply moves, and yet it moves differently. Once the wealthy state is assumed, behavior shifts without effort. Decisions become calmer, timing improves, and opportunities are recognized rather than chased. Neville emphasized that this unfolding is automatic, not because of luck, but because consciousness has already selected the destination. The bridge exists to make the journey appear natural. Each step feels reasonable, even mundane, which is why those still looking for excitement often overlook the very process delivering their desire. The analogy is precise. A person who already thinks like the role they are stepping into does not campaign for recognition. Promotion arrives quietly because the consciousness that matches the position is already in place. In the same way, wealth does not announce itself with fireworks when it comes through the bridge. It integrates. It blends into daily life so smoothly that it may take time to realize a shift has occurred. There is no sense of conquest, only recognition. This is also why genuine wealth feels different from emotional highs. Excitement belongs to acquisition, not ownership. It signals that something feels rare or temporary. The wealthy state, by contrast, carries a tone of neutrality. There is satisfaction without urgency, confidence without tension. Neville often pointed out that fulfillment feels natural, not overwhelming. When the state is real, the result does not shock the nervous system. It fits. Understanding this changes the relationship with outcomes entirely. Instead of scanning the horizon for signs, attention settles inward. The bridge of incidents does not require supervision. It only requires consistency of state. Once consciousness has moved, the world must follow, and it does so quietly, efficiently, and without spectacle. Real wealth rarely announces itself because it no longer needs to convince anyone, including the one experiencing it. There is a profound psychological shift that occurs when wealth is no longer anticipated but assumed, and it announces itself not through excitement, but through stillness. Neville referred to this inner stillness as the Sabbath, a term drawn from Scripture but used by him in a deeply psychological and metaphysical sense. The Sabbath is not a day, and it is not inactivity. It is the moment consciousness stops reaching forward because it has inwardly arrived. When this state is entered, the emotional turbulence that once surrounded money begins to dissolve, not by effort, but by irrelevance. Emotion around money is often celebrated as passion or motivation, yet Neville would have recognized it as evidence of separation. Strong emotional charge, whether hope or fear, signals that money is still perceived as external, conditional, and uncertain. Excitement arises because something feels rare or fragile. Anxiety arises because something feels threatened or unstable. Both emotions depend on the same assumption, that supply exists outside the self and must be watched, protected, or secured. The Sabbath replaces this assumption with quiet familiarity. What is familiar no longer provokes reaction. In this state, money does not disappear from awareness, but it loses its dominance over it. The mind no longer oscillates between anticipation and concern. There is no inner commentary rehearsing future scenarios or revisiting past mistakes. This absence of mental noise is not suppression, it is resolution. Neville emphasized that when a desire is truly assumed, the mind grows still around it. The problem dissolves not because it has been solved externally, but because it has been settled internally. This is why the wealthy state carries a distinctive emotional tone that is often misunderstood. It is calm, grounded, and remarkably ordinary. There is no constant checking, no compulsion to verify, no need to reassure oneself through numbers or symbols. The analogy of not checking a bank app captures this perfectly. The impulse to check does not come from diligence, it comes from doubt. When doubt is absent, verification becomes unnecessary. Certainty renders monitoring redundant. The Sabbath also marks the end of inner negotiation. Before this state is entered, the mind bargains constantly, asking how, when, and whether. These questions are not innocent. They are expressions of a consciousness that has not yet accepted its own position. Once acceptance occurs, the questions lose their relevance. The mind stops interfering with the process because it recognizes that nothing remains to be done. Neville described this as rest, not because life stops moving, but because the inner argument has ended. This rest has a stabilizing effect on behavior. Decisions become simpler and more intuitive. There is less urgency, less impulsivity, and less emotional overreaction to fluctuation. Money is no longer used to regulate self-worth or emotional security because those functions have already been resolved at the level of identity. The nervous system, no longer braced against uncertainty, operates from a baseline of sufficiency. This is why wealth assumed in consciousness tends to persist. It is not being used to fill a void. What surprises many is that this state often feels quieter than expected. Those who imagined wealth as a constant emotional high may initially misinterpret the Sabbath as indifference or loss of desire. Yet Neville would insist that this quietness is the very proof of fulfillment. Desire is noisy when it is unfulfilled. Fulfillment is silent because it no longer seeks attention. It simply is. This silence points to a deeper realization taking shape beneath the surface. When money no longer carries emotional weight, it reveals that wealth was never the ultimate aim. It was a symbol, a mirror reflecting a more fundamental shift in identity. The Sabbath is not merely rest from financial striving, it is rest from the belief that conditions define the self. In this rest, consciousness begins to recognize itself as the source rather than the seeker, and money settles naturally into its proper place as a tool, not a measure of being. There is a point in this teaching where the subject of money begins to recede, not because it has been dismissed, but because something more fundamental steps into view. Neville called this realization the promise, and it does not belong to wealth, health, or circumstance at all. It belongs to identity. When consciousness recognizes itself as I am, conditions lose their authority to define value. Wealth in this light is no longer a goal but a byproduct, an echo of a deeper knowing that has already taken place. The phrase I am is often repeated casually, yet Neville treated it with reverence because it points to the source of all states. I am is not a declaration of attributes, it is awareness of being itself. Before wealth or poverty, before success or struggle, there is the simple fact of awareness. When this awareness is known directly, identity loosens its grip on conditions. One no longer derives a sense of self from what appears. Instead, appearances are recognized as expressions of what is assumed to be true within. This is where wealth reveals its secondary nature. Money does not confer identity, it reflects it. When identity is anchored in conditions, wealth becomes unstable because conditions are unstable by nature. But when identity rests in I am, wealth becomes incidental. It comes and goes without disturbing the center, because the center no longer depends on it. Neville insisted that this was the true freedom, not the accumulation of things, but liberation from being defined by them. The analogy clarifies the shift. Imagine discovering that the vault you had been searching for was inside the house all along. The frantic searching, the fear of lack, the obsession with access, all dissolve at once. The treasure was never external. It was misidentified. In the same way, recognizing I am dissolves the illusion that power resides outside the self. Wealth appears differently when it is no longer being asked to provide safety, worth, or identity. This realization also explains why wealth assumed from I am carries a different quality. It is quieter, more stable, and less dramatic. There is no need to announce it or defend it because it is not being used to prove anything. The inner shift has already occurred. Neville often noted that when the deeper realization dawns, desires are fulfilled more easily, sometimes even unexpectedly, because they are no longer burdened with emotional demand. They arise, are assumed, and dissolve into fulfillment without struggle. Yet this is not an escape from the world or a rejection of material experience. Neville was clear that awakening does not negate desire. It purifies it. When desire arises from I am rather than from lack, it moves without resistance. Wealth, in this context, becomes a natural expression of order rather than a desperate acquisition. It fits into life instead of dominating it. As this understanding settles, the teaching circles back on itself with new clarity. Money was never the problem, and it was never the solution. It was a reflection pointing inward. The recognition of I am does not make wealth unnecessary. It makes it secondary, and in doing so, it removes the strain that once surrounded it. This brings the teaching to its final instruction, not as a command but as a natural conclusion drawn from everything that has been seen. When all arguments fall away, what remains is not a strategy, but a shift in recognition. Neville's central truth was never concerned with the mechanics of wealth, but with the nature of being itself. You do not get rich in the sense the world usually means it. You awaken to being wealthy by assuming a state that already exists within consciousness. This awakening is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It feels more like remembering something that had been overlooked than achieving something new, and yet this quiet remembrance changes everything that follows. This is why what appears as fake wealth cannot sustain itself. It is not wrong or immoral. It is simply unsupported. When wealth is treated as an image to be maintained rather than a state to be lived, it requires constant reinforcement. Attention must be held, appearances must be preserved, and anxiety remains close to the surface. Neville would say that such wealth is borrowed, not owned, because ownership in his teaching belongs to consciousness, not to circumstances. Without state permanence, conditions fluctuate until they once again reflect the inner image accurately. The mirror analogy Neville used makes this unavoidable. The mirror does not decide what to show. It reflects what is placed before it, instantly and faithfully. No reflection can outrun its source, and no image can appear without an original. In the same way, money cannot stabilize beyond the identity that produces it. Attempts to force the reflection only distort the image temporarily. Eventually, the mirror returns to honesty. This is not cruelty, it is precision. Consciousness never contradicts itself. Here, the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton aligns seamlessly with Neville's metaphysics. Identity is not a philosophical idea. It is a biological and psychological program. When identity changes, behavior reorganizes automatically. Choices shift, tolerance levels adjust, and patterns of action recalibrate without conscious effort. External results follow because the inner command has already been given. When the program remains unchanged, no amount of surface correction can override it for long. The system always returns to what it recognizes as self. From this understanding, the instruction becomes inward rather than outward. Wealth is not created through force, discipline, or display. It is assumed through acceptance. The moment the wealthy self is entered inwardly, effort begins to fall away. The nervous system relaxes, urgency dissolves, and life moves with less friction. This assumption is most naturally accepted when the mind is quiet and the senses are softened, where identity can be impressed without debate. In that stillness, the self is not persuaded, it is recognized. Neville's closing reminder carries the weight of the entire teaching. To be is far greater than to become. Becoming implies distance, struggle, and delay. Being implies presence and completion. When wealth is understood as a state of being rather than a future condition, the chase ends. What follows is not excess emotion or constant excitement, but stability, clarity, and rest. And from that rest, the outer world rearranges itself, not as proof but as a natural consequence of what has already been assumed within.